Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and our topic for today's webinar is using solar to reduce peak loads, evaluating Rhode Island's distributed solar pilot. Our host for this webinar is Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at CESA, and we have two excellent guest speakers with us on the line today. But before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. So you have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your telephone, or you can use your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the little orange or red arrow that you see circled here, and that also works to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will read through your questions as they come in, and we'll get to as many as we can. We're hoping to save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the speakers. So again, I think we'll have a lot of people on the line today, probably a lot of questions as well. So do type your questions in. When you think of them, don't wait until the very end to type them in, just to make sure that we get to yours. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a follow-up email with a copy of the webinar recording within 48 hours, probably this afternoon. And all of our webinars are archived on our website at cesa.org/webinars. That includes copies of the recording and also a PDF of the slides. And that link is also a good place to find out about our upcoming webinars, of which we have quite a few. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Nate Hausman.
Thank you, Sam. Sure enough, as Sam said, I'm Nate Hausman. I'm a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance. And in case you're not familiar with us, the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA as we say, we're a nonprofit network of public agencies and organizations. We work together to advance clean energy, and CESA is made up of mostly state agencies, and you can see those state agencies on this slide here. The webinar is being conducted as part of our multi-state initiative to develop solar in locations that provide benefits to the grid. Under this project, CESA is working with 5 states, Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Washington, and Wisconsin, as well as the District of Columbia, to identify locations for solar and other distributed energy resources that provide those benefits to the grid. Our project broadly aims to sort of advance state decision-making for identifying high-value locations for distributed energy resource deployment, but each participating state has its own particular aims under the project. The project is part of the Solar Energy Innovation Network. That's a collaborative research effort. It's administered by the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, and that's supported by the Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office. Next. Yeah, so this webinar today is about a Rhode Island system reliability procurement project that used solar to reduce peak electrical loads. We've got 2 panelists for today. I'm going to introduce both of them now, and then I'll turn it over to them. I'll turn it over to Danny, who will introduce the project, and then pass it off to Shawn, who will talk about the Cadmus report on this project, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. So let me introduce them. Danny Musher is the Chief of Program Development at the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources. He works on a variety of clean energy policy and planning issues with a focus on electric utility regulation, grid modernization, and thermal efficiency and renewables. Danny was the author of Rhode Island's first data-driven state energy plan, which was formally adopted in 2015. Danny holds a Bachelor's of Arts from Brown University. Shawn Shaw is a principal with Cadmus. He has 14 years of experience in renewable energy and distributed resources. This work has included program evaluation, economic feasibility studies, measurement and verification, engineering, and field inspections. Shawn has also supported the rapid growth of the energy storage industry through modeling and technical analyses related to combining energy storage with renewable energy applications and leading efforts to reduce energy storage soft costs through better understanding of system performance. Okay, well, with those introductions out of the way, I'll pass it off to you, Danny. Danny, the platform's yours.
Thanks, Nate. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Thanks. Really happy to be here today. Thanks to Nate and CISA for arranging this webinar, and also to Shawn and his team at Cadmus for completing the evaluation on the pilot that we did. And I'm going to try to make my remarks relatively brief so we can get to Shawn's presentation, since there's a lot of good material in there. But I'll give an overall background of the pilot that our office administered. OER, we're Rhode Island's lead state agency on energy policies and programs. We have a variety of different areas we work on: renewables, efficiency, heating and transportation, working to achieve a clean, affordable, and reliable energy future for our state. So by way of a little bit of background, in Rhode Island, we have a policy called System Reliability Procurement, or SRP. This is a program that requires our electric distribution utility, National Grid, to evaluate non-wires alternatives, or NWA for short, as solutions instead of traditional utilities, poles, and wires investments. And so over the past few years, there's been one major SRP pilot ongoing in the state, in the eastern part of the state, in the towns of Tiverton and Little Compton. The goal of the pilot was to achieve a 1 megawatt peak load reduction in order to defer a $2.9 million substation feeder. Primarily, the implementation of this SRP pilot was a variety of different customer programs offered to residents in the area, specific energy efficiency measures, some demand response programs, and National Grid implemented this program over the course of several years. But OER and other stakeholders were interested in the lessons that we were learning from the efficiency and demand response portions of the pilot, but really had a strong interest in understanding whether there was some value, some peak reduction value and distribution deferral value that solar could provide through this pilot. So we stepped in and provided some funds to help integrate solar into this overall effort. We did some initial scoping and analytical work to support the design of the pilot, trying to understand how much solar we should really be deploying in the area, what types of configurations would provide the most distribution benefit from the solar, what implementation strategies should we be using to recruit and deploy these solar projects. And so I'll touch briefly on the two main implementation strategies that we used, a Solarized program and then an open RFP for a larger solar project. And overall, our initial goal was to achieve a 250 kW coincident peak reduction, which is equivalent to a quarter of the overall 1 megawatt reduction goal. And based on the initial analysis we had done, we were thinking that we would need to enroll about 520 kW nameplate of solar to achieve that reduction. So a little bit about the Solarized initiative approach. For those who aren't familiar, Solarized initiatives are basically a community engagement and group pricing offering for a town or a community, where the more people who sign up, the more attractive the pricing is that's offered by a solar installer to that community. So we ran basically a traditional Solarize campaign in the area to encourage residents to adopt solar, but we added a twist where we provided an incremental incentive for folks who had rooftops that were facing in a southwesterly or westerly direction, because those orientations would provide more solar production during the late afternoons in the summer when the distribution system needed that production and that peak load relief. And so we developed some analysis around what these rebates would be. There's a whole calculator that was developed. Shawn will talk a little bit more about that. But the idea was to basically compensate, to basically make the customer economics attractive for these residents to implement solar. So to make up the difference in lost revenue between a western-facing solar system and a south-facing solar system and on an annual basis. So how much net metering revenue they would be estimated to lose, or the minimum of that, or the incremental value to the distribution system, based on the deferral value of that the substation feeder that would need to be constructed. So we did a little bit of math around that, and then for the RFP, we made this RFP eligible to larger projects. We're looking to kind of diversify the portfolio, get some small rooftop projects, and then get a larger ground-mounted system. And we have a statewide feed-in tariff called the Renewable Energy Growth Program. And so we offered to projects that were bidding into this program a competitively awarded grant that would compensate the project developer for either incremental costs to incorporate tracking technology, or to compensate them for lost revenue for orienting their project to the west, in order to maximize benefit to the distribution system at the expense of overall annual generation. And so we, again, had a formula here where we basically awarded the project based on its net benefit to the distribution system, based on a pre-calculated incremental distribution value, minus whatever the bid was from that developer. And the results were good. We enrolled more than we had originally thought to do. There was some slight customer attrition from the Solarized program, and all told, we were able to get 58 solar sites for a combined capacity of about 650 kilowatts of solar capacity. So we were pleased with the outcome. And Shawn will talk about how did the 650 kW nameplate of solar actually perform during the distribution peak period. One last slide to just give a little teaser of where we're going with this overall in Rhode Island. We are really moving from a model where the utility did a direct implementation of customer programs based on energy efficiency or demand response, to more of a open source, non-wires alternative approach, where we've asked National Grid to make data about their system loading available for free online to third-party developers. You can type into your Google right now, Rhode Island System Data Portal, and you'll be able to navigate to this site, which has a number of different mapping features and information about an overview of National Grid's distribution infrastructure, hosting capacity map, and then this heat map, which actually shows where there are distribution circuits that are approaching higher loadings and therefore would benefit from peak reduction. And National Grid will ultimately be issuing RFPs for these areas to enroll solar, storage, or any other type of distributed energy resource that can help reduce the peak load. So with that, I'll hand things off to Shawn so he can get into the details. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Danny. So I will be launching a brief introduction and then hopefully diving right into our findings. This is a pretty interesting pilot, and I think that Nate already did a great job of introducing me. One little update on that. So I've actually been with Cadmus for quite some time, and I'm a power systems engineer by training. But we do a lot of work, and I do a lot of work with helping state programs like OER evaluate the effectiveness of different types of programs. And it's been really exciting over the years to see the types of programs evolving out of entities like NYSERDA, MassDEC, OER, Energy Trust of Oregon, and others. Just more interesting, more advanced structures, more nuance evolving across the solar industry, the addition of new technologies, energy storage becoming a hot topic. It's been pretty interesting seeing the industry develop. Cadmus has been around for a good portion of that time. We were founded in 1983, and so for the last 35 years, we've been really providing our clients with a lot of consulting, technical assistance, and analysis around DER policies, program design, how to evaluate those programs, and especially focused on things like solar PV, microgrid technologies, energy storage, and renewable thermal technologies. So we try to offer a perspective that mixes technical and policy analysis right in there. And we do this across a variety of different service areas. So with that said, I want to make some special acknowledgments here, because a study like this does not come together just with Cadmus working alone. It was really a team effort. I want to especially recognize Danny and OER for having the leadership and the initiative to fund such a study, which is fairly unique across the industry. This isn't something that's really been looked at before, and then I think it really took some leadership to step forward and make that happen. I also would be remiss in overlooking the good folks at National Grid, who really were pretty instrumental in how this study was able to come together. We relied heavily on National Grid to supply us with data about the feeder conditions that I'll get to in a few minutes. And without that kind of data and without their feedback on our findings, I think that the study would not have been nearly so informative as I hope we'll all find it. And then finally, I want to acknowledge Stephen and James on my team, our project manager and lead data analyst, respectively. They put in a lot of hard work analyzing things in ways that maybe hadn't been done very much before. So I'm hoping everybody enjoys hearing about some of the results they worked so hard to produce over the next few minutes. There we go. So we already heard a little bit of an overview of the system reliability procurement, and I won't hopefully repeat too much here, but I think it's worth putting the DG pilot in the broader context. So the SRP comes out of requirements starting in 2006 for National Grid to pursue cost-effective energy efficiency and other types of resources as an alternative to traditional, as Danny put it, poles and wires construction. We're seeing this becoming, or these sort of non-wires alternatives, or NWA measures. We're seeing these picked up all across the country as a means for utilities to begin evaluating their options with respect to addressing grid constraints. No longer are many utilities focused solely on these sort of traditional transformers and cabling upgrades and such. They're now looking more broadly at other types of solutions, and in some cases, those solutions can be quite cost effective. So utilities are really stepping up to the plate across the country and starting to think differently and maybe a little bit more holistically about what they can do to serve customers beyond things that they may have done in past decades. The SRP in particular, and I won't get into this too much, but there's some great reports out, I believe, on National Grid's website that go into more detail on the efficiency side of things in the SRP, but they're funding things like smart thermostats and controls, efficient HVAC, and that's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and lighting technologies like LEDs, as well as demand response. So that is really something that is contributing to the SRP as a whole, and leads us well into sort of what the DG pilot is focused on. So in addition to funding those particular types of measures, the SRP includes a whole suite of individual programs. So this is really sort of a portfolio effort that's being put forth to address the needs of the constrained infrastructure that Danny mentioned and that I'll discuss a little bit further. So the DG pilot is really geared toward our focus here, and Danny already mentioned the two key elements of it. So the Solarized program, which is sort of if you want to think of it as a bulk purchasing arrangement. These are used all over the country by state agencies as a way to very cost effectively accelerate solar deployment. So solar penetration into an average town that doesn't have a Solarized program tends to be fairly modest. We think of solar, when we're in the industry, we think of solar as being fairly prevalent, but it's still only actually appearing on a small percentage of homes and businesses. So for the cost of essentially some technical support and setting up marketing programs and that sort of thing, a state agency can drive adoption way up in a particular community or a region by supporting them in that way. And this doesn't even necessarily come down to direct incentives. It's largely just getting everybody together so that solar installers can reduce their cost of customer acquisition. And that's one of the key elements that was in play in Tiverton and Little Compton. And then, of course, the tracking PV system, which for those that don't do a lot of work in the Northeast, tracking PV is a little bit unusual up here. You're more likely to see tracking PV systems in areas with more direct irradiance than we have. So in the Northeast, it's cloudy quite a bit of the time, which means that tracking has less overall benefit than it would in an area where it's less cloudy and you get most of your energy from the sun's what's called direct beam irradiance, which is the light coming directly from the sun as opposed to from the whole sky. So this was a kind of an unusual project and a pretty interesting one. So the key players here, we know OER, we know their role. National Grid as the utility partner for the pilot. We were the evaluator, which means it's our job to say how well the program did or didn't work. Soul Power, you'll hear them mentioned a little bit. They were the installer chosen to install the projects through the Solarized programs. The local residents in the town responded to that opportunity and installed solar on their homes. So the town officials obviously had a big role to play in the Solarized program because they have to work closely with OER, with Soul Power, make sure that these systems are installed, bring customers to the table to make this worthwhile and effective for everyone. And then Smart Power provided the marketing support for Solarize. So of course they were deeply involved in this as well. Our study has a couple of key elements to it. So the first is data collection, and that really required us to work closely with Soul Power and with some of the metering providers that were involved. So SolarLog, Locus, both parties were involved in collecting the data from these installations. And that really took quite a bit of coordination. We had to collect relevant weather data, the utility SCADA, that's just the data from the utility substation telling us what's happening on the feeders we're concerned about. And then, of course, all of the PV generation data. So we had to analyze all of that data, and we did it in 2 rounds. We weren't focused on this as an annual study. It was really focused on 2 summer periods, 2016 and 2017. And the results between them were a little bit different, and I'll get into some of that in a few minutes. And then we conducted what we call in the business a process evaluation, which basically means we talk to a lot of people and use our expertise in how these programs are structured and how they operate to try to understand maybe what worked well, what might have worked better, what could be done differently next time, through conversations with all of the key stakeholders like Soul Power, OER, the residential customers, and the installers. Getting their feedback was pretty critical. So through the study, we ended up with 57 residential installations happening between Little Compton and Tiverton. So almost equal between the two of them in terms of number of sites, a little more capacity, and a few more people in Little Compton, but that's sort of to be expected. And then the grid support solar field was just a hair under 250 kW of DC capacity. So overall, the pilot resulted in about 650 kilowatts of nameplate installed capacity. And I think, one thing that's important to note here is that though Little Compton is sort of a bigger town, a lot of the Solarize activity happened during a time when the residents weren't necessarily in the area. It's a heavily summer-oriented population, and the Solarized program didn't happen during that time. So I'll get into more about the Solarized program in a few minutes. But that's sort of what was in our scope. And here you can see a timeline. I won't read this whole thing off, but you can see that it was a couple of years in the making to sort of get the program off the ground, get the evaluation done. And then our evaluation was finished in May, and we were able to wrap up the report. So this is pretty new information we're discussing here today, hot off the press, if you will. Before I can get into the promised results, a couple of bits of nomenclature for everybody that you might see pop up in the presentation. So most folks who are involved in solar have a reasonable idea about at least some of these, but for those that don't, I'll cover them quickly. Capacity factor is simply a measure of how effective or how much energy is being generated by the PV relative to its, in this case, nameplate capacity. So typical PV systems you might see over the course of a year averaging, say, 12 to 18% capacity factor in the Northeast. There are things that can make that go up or down, but that's sort of the range you're looking at. So if you want to think of it this way, if you could convert every single DC watt into a delivered AC watt for the whole year, you'd have a capacity factor of 100%. But that's not usually how PV operates. For our purposes, we're going to consider coincident hours. Those are the hours that are basically the top 10% of load hours during the study period. So if you took all of the load hours, every hour of the year, and you had its load on the feeder, and you sorted it from highest to lowest, you took the top 10%, those would be what we call the coincident hours. That's different than the peak hour, which is the single highest. So if the coincident hours are the top 10% of that list, the peak hour is the number at the very top. So that is the highest load hour during our study period. And then the peak load is how much energy or what the average demand was during that same period. So to put a picture on this is the load on the feeders that we're looking at. The combined load, just about 17.5 megawatts at peak, and you can see here that peak is occurring pretty late in the day. So, for example, these are sort of military time, but if you look at 17, which is around 5 p.m., 18 is 6 p.m. and so on. So between, say, 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., that's really when we see a lot of the peak here. And this graph happens to be from the 2016 period, but it's really just to kind of illustrate what's going on here. So that gives us the flavor of it. And why do we care, right? So the feeder load is high. Excuse me. So the feeder load is high. What happens in that situation is you're sort of putting stress on the utility infrastructure, and that causes a lot of heat. That causes the system to operate less efficiently and potentially shut down. If the system is overloaded, that ultimately is the kind of thing that can lead to a loss of quality in the available power grid. So this is one of the reasons we really want to avoid that. And as one of the hypotheses for this whole study that Danny really went into nicely is that if we point our PV arrays so that they capture more sun that coincides with that sort of late afternoon, early evening peak time on the feeder, there's an extra value there. A system that's pointed south will produce on a clear day, its highest output during around noon, which is very early compared to when the peak is that we're trying to reduce. So if we can orient those systems in a more westerly direction, the thought is that we can do a little better. And in fact, we saw that. So on the bottom x-axis, if you will, of the graph, you see the orientation. So 180 degrees is pointed solar due south. 270 degrees would be due west. So as you see these lines kind of rising, what you're seeing is that during those coincident peak hours, the top 10% hours, you're seeing that the capacity factor of those systems tends to increase quite a bit. So you see capacity factors in the 40% range for those hours when the systems are west facing, whereas a south facing system might be 10 to 20% during that same time. So clearly there is a benefit in the time that we're focused on by orienting the systems to the west. So that hypothesis turned out to be, in essence, true. So here's just to sort of line things up together, give everyone a flavor. This is the top graph is the residential fleet. The middle graph is the tracking PV system, and the bottom graph is the sort of load on the feeder. So you can see how these things line up and get kind of a visual sense for it. So the top graph you can see has sort of a dome shape to it. That means that we're still sort of seeing, for the residential fleet, we're still seeing that there's a lot of output happening in the middle of the day. But if you took, because so many of these systems are west facing, you can see that it does flatten out a bit. A typical PV fleet, if you chose it at random in, say, Boston, Massachusetts, might not look quite this way. It might be a little sharper, a little more oriented toward noon. But it's not a really marked spread. The second graph showing the tracking PV system, however, you can see it's almost flat between, say, 8 a.m. and 4 p.m. And that's really because, as designed, that system orients the array toward the sun all day long. So it is able to provide a more level output on average. You can see here, though, and I'll get to this more in a moment, but you can see here we're still sort of tapering off a little bit as we head into what we saw as those peak hours, and that's really where the things get interesting, I'd say. So here you can see same idea. Unfortunately, in this graph, the residential fleet is in the middle and the field site is on the top. But we've also highlighted the peak hour. So in 2017, the peak hour on the feeder happened between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. And so you can see here for both the field, the solar field site, and for the residential fleet, that highlighted bar, that shaded in bar that's in each of the graphs corresponds to what the output was. So while the feeder was peaking, both PV systems were indeed producing, but they were only producing at, say, half or even a little less than half of kind of their peak output. So it helps, but maybe not quite as much as we would have liked. But it is important to note that of those top 10% load hours, half of them occurred, well, more than half of them occurred, I should say, between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. So when you consider the peak hour, that's happening between 5 and 6, but there's a lot of secondary peaks, if you will, or almost peaks happening between 3 and 8, which is a time frame that's a little wider and a time in which solar can be generally a bit more responsive. So it's important to look at not only that 1 hour during the whole year that's the highest, but there might be 10 other hours that are 99% of the same peak and also important that are not captured in that. So we tried to look at both sides of this during the study. So overall, what we found, and this is when you look at the top 10% hours. So when we say things like coincident capacity factor, that's that top 10% hours figure. And so what you can see here is you start to develop sort of a rule of thumb way of looking at this. And so most folks in the PV industry think about things in terms of nameplate kW. That's a kilowatt DC on your PV module. And here you can see that for an average sort of south-facing residential PV system, if you put in a kilowatt of nameplate solar, you can expect around 210 watts of AC coincident peak reduction on those top 10% hours. That increases by about a factor of 50% if you orient those systems, or if you install that same 1 kilowatt of solar on a tracking system. And then the west-facing array kind of falls in between. Still quite a bit higher than the south-facing, but not quite as good as the tracking system. So these are highlighted in the table below, and I'll get into some of these other numbers, so don't worry too much about the table right now. But that's really the takeaway, is you're looking at somewhere between 0.2 and 0.3 kilowatts of demand reduction for every kilowatt of nameplate solar you install. But the real question always comes up, well, is PV reliable? Is it secure? Is it something that we can bank on? So we measured this. I apologize if this is a review or too much stats one way or the other, but we had something called the coefficient of variability, which is just the standard deviation divided by the mean, which is basically the spread of the data divided by the average of the data. And so what it does is it gives you kind of a percentage figure to give you a sense of how close to the average most of the data falls. So if I tell you the average is 0.2 kilowatts AC per kilowatt installed, that tells you kind of how big the range is in which most of the systems would fall. So a lower value tends to mean that most systems are pretty close to the average, and a higher value would tell you that there's quite a bit of spread or dispersion in the data. So what we found here is that the south-facing systems really had the highest spread, and that may be for a variety of reasons. A system installed on a roof might be economical with a big tree on the west side, but that's going to mean that system is on the low end for our purposes. Or a system might be oriented, a little bit to the southwest, and maybe it picks up a little bit more than we would expect. So there's a big range in what can happen there. The west-facing systems were a little more reliable. In that they had a CV of 90%, which kind of means that you would expect 2/3 of the systems to be producing within 90% of the average. So it's still a fairly big spread, but definitely better than what we saw with the south-facing systems, and that could be for a variety of reasons. But that's kind of how the data came out, and we saw overall across the fleet. In 2016, the CV was a little bit lower. So again, that means that there was a little less dispersion in the data. And in 2017, it was a little higher. It's also important to note, if you didn't pick up on it in my earlier slide, that 2017 was actually a bit sunnier than 2016 was. So the CV is a little higher, but then again, the absolute available energy was also higher. So you might expect there to be a little bit more dispersion in that. So hopefully that didn't put everyone to sleep. But the cost effectiveness of this is really something to consider. Danny did a nice job talking about sort of the incremental value to the grid, and that's how the incentives were set. And if you've got a sharp eye, you'll notice that the incentives in this table don't quite match what the incentives were in Danny's table, and that's because we've grouped things into these categories. So in what we call the West category, for example, that's going to include a variety of different, more incremental incentive levels that went into the calculator that they used in the Solarized program. So, but what you can see here is that normally people are less likely to install west-facing PV systems because they do generate a bit less electricity on average over the year, about 10% less, which matched well with our predictions before the study. So part of what we need to do if we want to get those folks to install solar and provide some demand reduction is to provide them a pretty high incentive. Those who have more south-facing systems arguably would have installed solar anyway because it's cost-effective. So they tend to need a little bit less of an incentive to kind of get them into the program, whereas those with west-facing systems need a little more of an incentive. So at the end of the day, between the variable SRP incentives and the incentives available from the Rhode Island Renewable Energy Funds through their incentive program, every group other than the single axis tracker kind of ended up with the same incentive per kW of load reduction, because the SRP incentive was a little higher for west-facing systems, but they also reduced more load. Those don't quite track exactly, but that value is definitely there. So the other thing that we looked at, and this was, I would say, maybe not the focus of the study, but was an important element, was how do we get to 5% demand reduction? If we were to really scale this up, what would it take? And kind of what we ended up with is that we would need about 0.6 megawatts of load reduction, which would require an investment of about 3 to 3.1 million in total incentives. And again, that's sort of based on that table I just showed a moment ago, in order to get that solar installed. Alternatively, if we wanted to focus on larger single axis tracking style systems, we could probably do it for a little less than half that amount. But then you don't get as many benefits in terms of having residential customers saving on their electricity bills and that sort of thing. So there's always a trade-off. And we've known for a long time that larger systems are on paper more cost effective. The other part of this that we looked at is, okay, so solar is variable. We talked about that a few minutes ago. Well, and it's also not terribly dispatchable. Our friends at National Grid, no matter how much they might like to, have sort of a hard time pushing a button in their office and making the sun shine brighter. Maybe that's coming up, but in the meantime, we have things like energy storage that are a bit more controllable. So if we are going to provide that kind of peak reduction, we would need something like 150 to 200 residential systems, something like a Tesla Powerwall or one of the Sonnen battery systems. We didn't model any, particular unit, but something like that. Or we'd need 3 250 kW 4-hour bulk energy storage systems like the one you can see in the photo on the left. So that sort of gives you a scale of what we're talking about, and battery prices are falling rapidly, so you can sort of do some quick research and make up your own mind whether or not that is a cost-effective alternative or perhaps supplement to using solar. So I would say overall the process portion of this worked out very well in terms of how the Solarized program went. It was pretty successful, especially considering that the campaigns happened after the summer residents had left by and large. So we were dealing with an average conversion rate, but an average conversion rate for a town whose a large portion of the population wasn't available to participate. And I would say that there were a couple of things that came up too around communications. We learned some lessons about keeping communications to those residential customers pretty streamlined and simple, not trying to get into too many details about feeder load reduction and how to calculate shading losses for west-facing systems and that sort of thing. I think that was definitely a lesson learned. I understand Equinox had a little bit of trouble getting all of the financing lined up because, again, this is sort of an unusual project for Rhode Island, so some lessons to be learned in the financing community as well. So I'd say overall pretty successful campaign from a variety of perspectives, but definitely some lessons learned. One of the challenges we ran into in the evaluation was really around the availability and effectiveness of the data collection. So the Solarize installer installed solar log meters on those residential sites I mentioned, and then there was a translation between the solar log portal and Locus, which was collecting the data from the solar field project. So we sort of centralized everything in Locus and then got the data out. Unfortunately, we had a little trouble and we're only able to get a little less than half of the residential sites to report data reliably enough for us to use it. So the solar log metering platform and the communications there proved to be a bit of a challenge. So we got a good set of data to analyze, but not as much as we would have liked or maybe expected going into it. So, in conclusions, I would say that overall, we were shooting for 250 kW. The pilot in 2017 did manage to, by our calculations, reduce load by about 182.1 kW. So substantial, but we did fall a little short of what we were shooting for. The demand reduction benefits do have some variability, and that variability is based not only on the spread of the PV system performance and the weather that drives that, but also on when the peak occurred. Shifting that peak even an hour later in the day will have a substantial impact on the PV's fleet's ability to respond and reduce. So, and also during the year, we saw in 2016, the peak occurred a little later in the summer and a little later in the day. And so the ability to address that peak was indeed lower. The Solarized program was definitely a success. I would say if we could have got that going during a more populated time in those towns, it would have been even better. But even so, was still quite successful. And the west-facing systems did produce about 50% more electricity per kilowatt than those south-facing systems during the time frame we were concerned about. But when you annualize that, about 10% less. So you are taking a hit in annual production, and that is probably going to require some market mechanism to incentivize people to do things the way you want them to. So the demand reduction achievement can be cost effective compared to some of the infrastructure costs we're trying to avoid, but there are a few things to consider. I know many of the folks on the line are probably in a position to be running programs like this, so I would offer a couple of quick considerations, and then we can move to questions. So I'd say that coordinating the demand reduction program with any other available incentives is pretty critical. One of the most successful parts of this was the good coordination between the REF incentive program and what the SRP was trying to achieve. So allowing, for example, the shading requirements through the TSRF to be a little bit looser through the incentive program meant that some of these folks with west-facing systems not only could get the SRP incentive, but could get the even more substantial REF incentive too, and that really made these projects able to pencil out. Optimizing the incentive levels is pretty key. I think that the program did a good job of doing that, but there's also maybe some room to look at that a little bit more carefully. So, for example, making sure that you're not paying incentives to fund folks that might have installed solar anyway, and really focusing in on expanding that population of people that are going to install solar in the first place. So making sure you have that. I wouldn't take metering for granted. I've seen a lot of programs sort of say, yeah, the installer is putting meters on every system, so we'll just grab it. And not that we did that here, but that is definitely something that needs a little more thought and care. PV installers are great and they know their business, but they are also not really trained metering technicians. It's a deceptively different skill set, and one that you can't sort of take for granted coming into this. And then I think it's important to consider that a diversity of resources is really important. Energy storage looks very promising as a way to solve these kinds of problems, but DG has a strong role to play and can be a pretty cost-effective way to reduce demand. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I understand we have some questions, so I'll turn it back over to Nate.
Yeah, thanks. We sure do have some questions. Thanks, Shawn. That was great, and Danny, thank you too. It's an interesting pilot and a great evaluation. So we got a bunch of questions. We'll start with this question. You know, there was lots of collaboration in terms of the planning for this project between, municipal officials, National Grid, Sol Power, OER, others. How difficult was sort of the planning process, and are those resource costs included in your sort of overall economic analysis of the project? I'll I'll let you take a crack at that, Shawn, first, and then maybe we can let Danny have a go at it too.
Sure, and I think Danny will have some great stuff to add here. So for purposes of the study, we did not include the costs of that coordination. In our case, we provided sort of an independent evaluation of the program. That's not usually rolled into the administrative cost. And I'd say the collaboration was sort of an ongoing bit. And one of the things to think about there is, are you looking at the cost of running the program, or are you looking at the cost of studying running the program? And obviously the 10th time you run the program, those studying related costs aren't really present, or at least not nearly as much. So I'll turn it over to Danny. Danny, I don't know if you want to add anything else, especially about the early stages of the program.
Sure. Yeah, I think Shawn got it right that we didn't include evaluation costs or program administrative costs in the cost effectiveness calculations. I would say much of the coordination at the beginning of the pilot was really between our staff and National Grid, and we both to coordinate the SRP activities that National Grid was implementing with our Solarize activities out in the community, so that when people found out about the solar offerings, they were also aware of the efficiency or demand response offerings that National Grid was providing in that area. So we worked very, very close with National Grid. We have staff that run Solarized programs, and they do a great job of interacting with on the municipal side and coordinating there. Ultimately, our goal really is not long-term for OER to be administering these types of programs. It's really for National Grid as the utility to be taking ownership of this, and implementing these types of programs or issuing these types of RFPs in the future. So our focus was really on working closely with their team to make sure that their questions were being answered, and that they can use the incremental incentive design or the RFP design as a basis for their future activities with non-wires alternatives.
Thanks. So I've got a bunch of questions about the role of battery storage. Shawn, you mentioned, there may be a role for storage moving forward and thinking about this future pilots. Danny, while you were answering the last question, can you also weigh in on when did you consider battery storage when you were planning this pilot?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting to see how things have evolved over time, because back in 2014 and 2015, when we were thinking about how we could put solar into this project, the battery storage industry was really, I think, in a different place than it is right now. So you're always sort of playing catch up. Back then we were asking why not solar, and now we're asking why not batteries. So the short answer is that we did think about batteries. The numbers were not really penciling out at the time that we were looking at them back in 2014. And then we decided really just to simplify things, to ask sort of one research question at a time, and really just focus on understanding the solar component. Since that time, we've continually been pushing National Grid to expand and improve their SRP efforts. So actually in 2016 or 2017, I can't remember offhand which year exactly, they issued another sort of generic RFP, not specifically for solar, but really just a generic RFP for peak reduction in the area. And actually the winning bid did go to a battery storage project. So there's a 250 kW, 1 megawatt hour battery system that is going into place in the area, and will have essentially a distribution reliability contract with National Grid to provide 250 kW peak reduction for 4 hours, a certain number of times per summer, and then the rest of the year, the third-party company that's going to be owning and operating that system will be doing frequency regulation activities to supplement the revenues that they'll be getting from the distribution reliability activities with National Grid. So we will see storage going into the area as well, in addition to the solar resources.
Gotcha. And maybe this is an appropriate follow-on, but part of the project you mentioned, involved a 250 kW solar array. In terms of reducing peak demand, which of the following solutions would be more cost-effective as an add-on to a large 250 kW solar array? Adding a tracking system or adding energy storage? Shawn, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, so that's quite a bit to unpack, but I would say, if it's an existing array, the chances that you could retrofit a tracking system onto it are probably a little lower, especially, you've already outlined the footprint of the system and all of that. So as a retrofit, I would say energy storage is likely a more attractive alternative. But if you're looking at sort of a blank slate and you're at the design stage trying to decide which is going to be better, it could go either way. I would suspect, and this is going to vary case by case, and so insert all the appropriate consultant caveats there. But I would suspect that for the New England environment, you are likely to have a situation where you can do a little bit more with the energy storage than you can with the tracking array for reducing demand, compared to that. So if you're comparing a tracking array versus a fixed array plus energy storage, I think you can probably do a little better. But in this case, for example, the solar field received an incentive to pilot this tracking array at this scale. So it also depends on what you can get for incentives and whether you're participating in a pilot program like this one or something like that. So long way of saying I think energy storage may be on average, but it will vary.
Yeah, just to add one more thought into the mix there is, I think it really depends, at least on the energy storage side, what's the kind of arrangement that is it owned by the utility or is it owned by a third party? And if it's owned by a third party, are they implementing a behind the meter solution for say a commercial customer who wants to reduce their demand charges, and are they able to basically, are they able to make the numbers work such that they can get other supplemental sources of revenue and reduce the cost of providing the distribution peak demand relief to the utility? And that's sort of the arrangement that we were able to see with the most recent RFP that Grid did, where this particular third-party provider is supplementing their distribution peak demand reduction revenues with wholesale market revenues from the frequency regulation activity. So it might, at least from the ratepayer perspective, it kind of depends on how that energy storage is being owned and what revenues it's getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And we're getting close to the top of the hour here. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'll give you both a shot to have with any to impart us with any parting thoughts. But from an evaluation perspective, can a conventional cost effectiveness test approach used for energy efficiency programs be applied to solar PV as a evaluation, measurement, and verification approach? Could the takeaway message here be that solar PV can be a cost-effective way to manage load in the same evaluation parlance as efficiency? That's to you, Shawn.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, actually, so I'd like to point to some great work that the Connecticut Green Bank has done with their residential solar investment program. And in fact, we helped them solve this very question. The short answer is yes. In evaluation language, there's something called the California Standard Practice Manual, which dictates some very specific cost effectiveness tests that usually are used for energy efficiency. They can, in fact, be applied to solar just as well, with a few differences. And it's great because as we went through that process with the Green Bank, we really started developing a very good set of common terms, and conversations really started flowing well with the utilities. So I would encourage other programs to think about developing that common framework, because as soon as you have that, you can start talking about bundling resources together where you have energy storage, solar, energy efficiency as a common program offering, and everyone can understand how cost effective that bundle is or is not. So it's really important and an important consideration for blending these programs together. They really can support each other quite nicely.
Great, thanks. Well, we've reached the hour mark. I want to thank you both, Shawn and Danny, for your presentations and your time and all your work on this pilot. Before signing off, I'll just give you both any final parting words for us. Shawn, to you first, and then to Danny.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, this is really sort of an innovative program. It's something that a lot of folks ask questions about, and I think it's great that the National Grid and OER and all the other stakeholders really rolled up their sleeves and were able to test this out. I think it's the kind of study where you probably could have done 2 or 3 of them without feeling like you repeated yourself. There's a lot of stuff here to unpack. So I would just say it's definitely a developing area, and there are a lot of opportunities here for utilities and state programs to explore and to work together on.
Yeah, and this is Danny. I just want to thank everyone for joining the webinar. Like Shawn mentioned, I know there's a lot of information packed into the presentation, so please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. My email is in the slide deck, and we're just happy to be able to share these results with all of you and appreciate your time.
Great, thanks much. And there are a lot of questions that we couldn't get to, and I want to thank everybody for those good questions, and to our audience for tuning in. I particularly want to thank Danny, you, and Shawn, you, for your presentations again, and I'll pass it over to Sam for our closeout.
Thanks, Nate, and thank you, Danny and Shawn, for your presentations. So I just want to let everyone know that we do have a lot more webinars coming up throughout the summer. You can find more information about those on our website, cesa.org/webinars. And to find more information about CESA, you can also visit our website. We're on Facebook and Twitter. And for more information about the multi-state initiative to develop solar in locations that provide benefits to the grid, you can visit the web address on the screen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we hope to see you at another webinar sometime soon.